Welcome everybody who's in attendance. To previous attendees, it's good to see you, or at least see your names there. To new attendees, thanks for joining the series. Maninder is out sick. He may be joining, so Divya and I will be hosting this presentation today. In the advertisement that you all should have seen, you've seen our presenters' biographical details. So I'll just give an overall snapshot here. We're welcoming John Simons. He's professor of philosophy and courtesy professor of computer science at the University of Kansas and director of the Center for Cyber Social Research. He's published research in computer science, math, applied economics, philosophy, 11 books or edited volumes, and over 60 articles or book chapters. And he was recently elected as a member of the International Academy for Philosophy of Science. And also joining us is Shea Sanwulu. She's a PhD student in philosophy at the University of Kansas with interests in ethics, philosophy of technology, and philosophy of love. We're extremely pleased to have them join us, and let's go ahead and enjoy their presentation now.
Well, great. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Divya and Maninder, for inviting us. As Bill said, my name is John Simmons. I'm professor of philosophy here at the University of Kansas, and we'll be jointly presenting this work, which is basically an overview of our ongoing work. Shea and I are working on a paper specifically on the possibility of close personal relationships with artificially intelligent systems. And this is part of a larger endeavor at the center where we're thinking about broadly the social harms and benefits of emerging technologies. So our project is really, from a philosophical perspective, an attempt to sort of reorient the discussion away from a more individualistic conception of, the current AI ethics discourse, and to focus more on characteristic or specifically social kinds of harms and benefits. So we have ongoing work related to norm change, how platforms and technologies modify social norms. We're interested in topics like, for example, epistemic injustice, how, for example, social status with respect to knowledge changes and so on. We're also interested in questions around close personal relationships and relationships more generally. So how can we think about the effects of technology on both our political lives, but also on our personal lives, and how technology can either play a salutary role in some cases or a detrimental role, depending on design choices. So there's a whole cluster of research topics, and I encourage you to go to the website for the center and check out some of what we're doing. Most recently, work with Ramon Alvarado on epistemic injustice. I think has had some effect on these discussions. Recent paper with Syed Abu Musab also focuses on social agency, specifically the social agency of artificially intelligent systems, and what it means to talk about agency in social terms, as opposed to the way that philosophers have traditionally thought about moral agency. We draw some distinctions there that I think are useful for this broader cluster of issues. So in this work, we're going to be, and Shea will largely lead the discussion today. We're going to be talking about the effects of platforms and chatbots and other AI technologies on our close personal relationships, which the concept of a close personal relationship, of course, has been of great interest to philosophers. And we're going to try to integrate existing debates around close personal relationships in our paper with these very concrete and practical new challenges that these technologies deliver. So I'm going to hand it over to Shea now.
Okay. So like John said, I'm just gonna give an overview for a start. And So we have evidence that Americans like currently have fewer close personal relationships and weakened levels of social connection than was the case in recent decades. And, sociologists have offered a variety of explanations for this change. So this is like some of the things we would be seeing. So again, loneliness is generally regarded as bad, and as such, it would be good if AI technologies could help alleviate our increasingly lonely condition. So again, this is like premised on the fact that we're social beings, right? So we need human interaction, we need connections with other people. And so loneliness, that isolation from the human community or from even interacting with other people is obviously going to be seen as something that is bad because it's, sort of negates how we're like, wired, which is to thrive on like social connections. Um, Again, but we're making, the argument that, but human persons are not replaceable by AI, even though technology can allow us to exercise some of the capacities that we associate with sociability and can allow us access to and can allow access to some of the goods that come with sociability. So now we think of how like technology has like permeated all through, our interactions in work, education, governance, all of that. And we think of how it can be useful in our close personal relationships, right? And that's why we have, some of this, tech emergence that we're going to be discussing briefly. But we're saying because of the lonely condition, because of this loneliness that people feel, we've seen people try to, create systems where human beings would be replaced by, AI, and then people form close personal relationships with them. But we are making the case that no, it's human beings are not replaceable by AI. So even though, technology can help us with some capacities of sociability, like we're that's like, our main point that human beings are not replaceable by AI. So again, I'm just going to like briefly go through this. So it's important to distinguish between exercise of social capabilities, acquisition of social goods, and social interactions with morally salient imperatives. Again, genuine close personal relationships involve moral imperatives that are not present in the interactions with AI, partly in virtue of our finitude, our embodied histories and perspectives, our capacity to withdraw, and our capacity to love in ways that excludes. So this is like basically like some of the sub themes we'll be looking at like in the paper, right? We're going to talk about questions like, oh, can artificial intelligence, can they be considered as, social beings? If we're going to be interacting with them, socially, can we consider them as that? Um, Again, looking at what marks human to human relationships, such as our affinity, this is very important. So the fact that you know that, oh, we're not going to be here for long, we have limited capabilities. I'm here now, I can't be there at the same time. It means I would have like scarce resources. I can't be friends with everybody. I can't love everybody. And this is tied to affinitude. Even our like unique embodied histories and our perspective, we have different experiences that make us who we are, right? My life story is going to be different from John's life story, is going to be different from Divya's life story. And that's like what makes us uniquely us. So if we have like relationships with other people, our relationships are marked by such, unique histories and perspectives. But the AI doesn't have that because, it's just programmed, right? And again, our capacity to withdraw and our capacity to love in ways that exclude are real markers of, close personal relationships. Like I said earlier, you can't be friends with everybody. I mean, if you're friends with everybody, then you're friends with no one, right? If you love everybody, then you love no one. So because we're limited, we sort of have like scarce resources, and so we have to decide how we manage our interactions. And that's why we have like few friends. That's why we can only be involved romantically with like few people, one person at a time, and all that stuff. So yeah, and I'm just gonna like briefly go through like a graph of decline in friendship, and this is like based on like in America. So if you look at in the 1990, people had like 8% of people had like no close friends. But if you compare that to 2021, you have like 15% of people have no close friends. So it means people are getting lonelier, right? Like this is evidence that show that people are getting lonelier. And in the 1990s, like men had like, 40% like more friends of 10 plus friends, right? But in 2021, you have just 15%. So that has dropped like drastically. And if you compare that like the women as well, 6% of women had no close friends in the 1990s, and now it's increased to like 10%. And in 1990, you had 28% of women are like 10 plus friends, and now it's decreased to 11%. So there is evidence that people are having fewer friendships. And so this is something to note as well. We see declining participation in religious communities. Again, like, religious communities are like places where people go to sort of find connection and, make friends, get to meet people and all that. But we see a decline from like the, sorry. Yeah. So from like the 1940s to 2020, you see a decline. Like people are not like, church membership among US adults is now below 50%. Like people are not like really going to like religious communities. Just the question is, where do people make friends? How do we meet people? Again, this is the draft for decline in marriage. Again, people have like, we have fewer marriages from the 1990s, like 2020. All of this is just to show that, we have fewer close personal relationships as the year progresses, right? So now, so there's this study by the Canadian Social Group.
Yeah, so this is a
And
government agency in
yeah,
Canada.
mhm. And then, they said that studies dating back to the 1980s show that loneliness and social isolation are associated with increased morbidity and mortality. So we could think that, oh, it's just, not having as many friends, not having like that much human interaction, but it's saying that people are dying because they are lonely, right? So this means that this is a crucial thing, it's something we have to absolutely talk about, right? And it's there with, obesity, sedentary living, air pollution. Loneliness is there, it's among the top, causes of why people die. So it's something that, we have to like talk about. Yeah, so I'm just gonna hand over to
Sure.
John.
So one way of thinking about loneliness, for example, is as a sort of a public health problem, right? That if we had dense social networks, we would have better public health. And this is one way of thinking about the exercise of social capabilities or social capacities in the context of close personal relationships and its, salutary effect on public health. However, there's another way to think about close personal relationships that we're considering too, which is a kind of a desire satisfaction model of close personal relationships, which is often figures in the philosophical literature. And we see this in terms of, one way of understanding the decline in the number of friends, for example, that Americans would have, is to correlate that, believe it or not, with increased wealth. So this is quite a striking phenomenon. So it might be the case, for example, that what Americans are doing as they become wealthier is they're managing to customize their close personal relationships. So we see, for example, that marriage in the United States has increasingly become pursued by the educated and wealthy rather than the poor. So marriage, in some sense, has become something like a luxury good. And there is some evidence, and we're not fully endorsing this, but this is something we're considering. There's evidence that prosperity leads to the customization of social relations. This is philosophically interesting too, if we think about close personal relationships as in some sense, a good in itself that people might pursue. And if we're curious as to what they value there, we might look at how it is that people make choices when they become able to make choices. So if, for example, you're in a context where you're living in close quarters with extended family, et cetera, where you have no choice but to live in close contact with large numbers of folks, neighbors, relatives, et cetera, then, okay, you might have a dense social network, et cetera, but if you had the choice not to live with your family, if you had the choice not to live in dense communities, maybe you would choose them. You would make those choices given the opportunity. So we're not closing the door on that as a possibility for an explanation of some of the statistical phenomena we see. And this is because, while we care about close personal relationships, they're also costly in some ways. So relationships impose responsibilities, often moral responsibilities, but also practical and material responsibilities. So there are distinctive kinds of goods that come with close personal relationships. There are also distinctive kinds of responsibilities and costs that come with close personal relationships. And it might be natural that we would tailor or customize these relationships given the opportunity, given increasing wealth, for example. So here's a quick graph on marriage rates by class in the United States. Class here is defined in terms of income, not in terms of education and so on, or other class markers, but purely by income. Okay. So in sociological studies of marriage rates, we see a strong correlation between money and social behavior. So money fosters increased wealth, fosters self-sufficiency, and it tends to reduce one's interest in other people, which is quite striking. So the wealthier you are, the less interest you have in others. That seems to be a pretty robust finding. Strikingly, for example, the wealthier people are, the more time they spend alone, the less time they spend socializing with others. These also seem to be pretty robust findings. So people with higher incomes seem to spend less time with their families and with neighbors and spend more time, for example, with their friends. So this is clearly a case of customization, that the wealthier you are, the more time you spend with friends rather than neighbors and families. So clearly, income is associated with how and when people spend their time. One question to unpack is the relationship between these findings and sort of, a kind of a characterization of how we value close personal relationships. Is it the case that given these results, we're kind of revealing what people actually think about close personal relationships, that they want to unburden themselves of the more challenging close personal relationships and increase their more pleasurable or more rewarding, more immediately rewarding, let's say, close personal relationships with their friends. So those are all questions that we're hoping to think more about going forward. We do recognize that close personal relationships, though, are demanding, and that they involve friction and they involve cost, and that people with higher income generally pay to avoid some of these costs, and that they would rather, apparently, given their behavior, customize their social lives in ways that reduce those costs. So now, as we see, and I'll hand it over to Shay at this point, AI offers a kind of customization opportunity or personalization opportunity that reduces the demandingness of these interactions. And I'll hand it over to Shay.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about Replica AI. And so Replica was created by Eugenia Kuda, and she created this app because she lost a friend and wanted to sort of recreate that interaction she had with her friend. So she created this app to put up their chats and all their interactions, and every time she felt lonely at the time, she would go back to the app and text her, or if she got a promotion or something, and then it would sort of recreate our interaction with our friend. So yeah, so that's like the background on replica AI. And I'm just going to like read some of the interactions that people have had with replica. And okay, maybe to say one more thing on replica. Replica allows you to customize it's like the type of friend you want. What would they look like? How would they talk? You know, what would be their characteristics? How would they respond to you? So it allows you to customize your friend. And so you could see from the chat, you know, the person texting saying, I got the new job. And, you know, Rebecca is responding like, oh my God, you're hired? Like, that's so exciting. When do you start? And it feels like, oh, you're interacting with, you know, somebody, right? Like it feels like you have somebody on the other side. And initially, like I said, you know, Rebecca was designed to be supportive. It was supposed to be a self-help chatbot. And your motto is like, it's always here to listen and talk, always on your side. And, you know, more screenshots of interactions with Replica, and you can see that it's responding as though it was, you know, another human being on the other end of it. And now, so Replica from mindfulness exercises in 2017 to engagement or addiction model now. Now Replica relies on premium subscriptions and maintaining engagement with the app. A lot of people have moved from what Replica was initially created for, which was for, you know, to have that support system, right? But now it has become something else. You'd see cases of, you know, pornography, all that stuff there. And yeah, and it's interesting because this is also tied to, if you look at the number of users and like when it got increased, you see that they had 35% increase in downloads during the pandemic. And what happened during the pandemic? People were isolated. So it shows that isolation and loneliness is a huge factor. And it's like why people would turn to, you know, AI as opposed to other human beings. So this, you know, just really shows our point that when people are lonely, I mean, you know, they want to find a solution, they want to find ways to interact. And then, you know, a lot of people will turn to like these apps. So you have other chatbots who that have been created to sort of mirror like what Replica does. You and you can see you can customize them your avatar to like look the way you want your ideal person to look like. So if you have, it's like you have, you pay for subscription, right? Like it's like with your money, you're able to customize your friends, you're able to customize how your friend looks like, how your friend talks to you. And you get interaction as though you were, you know, talking to a person. Yeah. So now this brings, you know, brings up like a very philosophical question, which is our interaction with chatbots, are they social? And are chatbots social agents? And, you know, this is important because then we have questions like, oh, what do we owe these chatbots? What do they owe us? Like if we regard them as social agents, you know, what obligations do we have towards them? What obligations do they have towards us? And this is because, you know, we know that agents other than adult humans can play a role in social systems. You know, you have like pets, you have non-human persons, you have children, you have babies, we interact with them like daily. And, you know, we have questions like, oh, what obligations do we have towards children? What obligations do we have towards pets? What obligations do we have towards the environment, right? Like these are things we interact with. So it's the question of if we consider chatbots, if we consider like this tech emergence as social agents, then it will be a question of what obligations do we have towards them. But again, we know that when we look at our interaction with present interactions with like chatbots, we say, okay, well, yeah, they can replace humans in like customer service roles. You know, you're trying to like call your phone company or call your bank or something, and then you have like that voice respond to you, say, oh, what is this you want to do today? You know, they can do that basic stuff, basic functional stuff. And but the question is, when it comes to human to human relationship, is that functional basic stuff, would that be sufficient for a close personal relationship? So And, you know, we then talk about exercising social skills and gaining some of the goods associated with sociability. So we can look at people in our environment that maybe will be benefiting a lot more from interacting with these chatbots because, you know, because of some, you know, limitations. For example, an elderly person might wish to share stories from the past. With an interactive audience. And if there's nobody willing to listen, right, a chatbot could be made available. So the chatbot could eliminate those stories with additional information, ask questions, play music of the time, and so on. So you have the elderly, right, like who want to talk to people, but again, a lot of people are having less friends. They're talking to families lesser. So that means, you know, the elderly ones are going to be isolated and they wouldn't have anybody to talk to. And so if you have like this chatbots would always be there, quite frankly, like it's never going to tell you it's tired. It's never going to tell you it's too busy for you. Like it's always going to be there. So the elderly person can, you know, tell its stories and it would respond. So there's nostalgia bots is not a Pygmalion in the model of replica, but it is customized to the needs of the elderly and isolated individual. So this would be an example of exercising some of the capacities that might otherwise figure in conversations with peers. So in places where, you know, there are no options of having that human-to-human connection, yeah, you would have like, you know, nostalgia bots play a role there. Now, how should we evaluate these interactions? Chatbot interaction can be a low-cost substitute for interactions with other human adults. Is this a bad thing, right? So if you have a case where there's an adult who is isolated, but they need human interaction and they choose to turn to chatbots, would it be a bad thing? Now, again, like making the case for like the elderly, we can see why it would make sense or why it could be acceptable for them to engage with these chatbots. Or cases of friendless people, you know, you have people who have, you know, so much social anxiety, who are unable to strike up conversations or even have friends. And you know, we could say, well, maybe they would benefit from interacting or even substituting human beings for AI. You know, what about people with socially unacceptable preferences? You know, people who have ideas or things that community would, you know, really ordinarily not approve of, or people who want to even harm themselves, right? Like who cut away interactions with other human beings just because, you know, they want to be by themselves. So what makes it good is that the person has a chance to exercise social capacities. So what will make these interactions good? So on one hand, if we would agree, or if we would say that, okay, well, let people interact with chatbots, it will be because they're still able to exercise some social capacities, which is to interact with the other, right? Like, and in this case, the other would be these chatbots. But again, now we're going to make, you know, a distinction between exercising social capacity versus social relationships. And we have
Whoops. There's that thing again.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But then we're going to make a distinction between merely exercising social capacities versus actually having, you know, social relationships. So if you exercise capacities, it's not going to be the same as having a relationship. So for example, if you are using a game app, for example, you know, you get like virtual money and like you have like coins and all that stuff that you can spend on the app. You feel like while you're playing the game, you feel like you're spending money, but it's not, you're really not spending money like in the actual sense, right? Like in the real world, you're not spending money. And that's sort of how it is where if you're interacting with this chatbot, it's sort of like, okay, well, you're spending money versus pretending to spend money. You're pretending to talk on the phone versus actually talking to another person if it were an actual relationship, right? So with the chatbots, it's making you feel like, oh, there's somebody else I'm talking to. So there's sort of that illusion of you're pretending to talk to somebody versus actually talking to another person, telling a lie to another person on the phone versus talking to oneself in private, exercising the vocal cords versus making a promise, right? So if you are chatting with the AI or like these chatbots and all that, it's like, oh, it gives you the feeling that there's somebody else on the other side. It's while it allows you exercise your social capacities, it doesn't enable you have a social relationship because again, it's just, you're pretending to be talking to somebody else. And even when it comes to the case of like, could you even make promise to like a chatbot, right? Like these are things we do like with friends in actual human relationships, or your friends are hosting a party or having something and you're asking, oh, would you be there? Like, oh yeah, I'm going to be there. And then if you break your promise, you break your word, you're not able to go, you owe them an apology. You say, oh, I wasn't able to do this because of this. Now, if you make a promise to a chatbot, would we be held responsible for breaking such promises? And so these are like some of the questions, because like when we think about, oh, well, it still allows us to engage our social capacities. But the question is, if you do break a promise to a chatbot, would we, say you've done something wrong? Would we say, that's like a morally wrong action? Yeah. So again, close personal relationships are definitely marked by uncertainty, friction. And I sort of like hinted at this earlier on to say, well, our personal relationships are marked by our finitude, right? The truth is there's only so much we can give. And we're not always there and not always on people's side. We don't always care, right? So it's like these things make our relationships precious, right? Because I only have so much I can give. I can only be here at this time. I can't be there. I mean, I can't like just walk through a wall. I'm limited. So it means that in my interactions with my friends, with my family, with my colleagues, I can only give so much, right? And that makes it precious because it means I can't just give myself the same way I give to my friends, to everybody. I wouldn't always be there. I would maybe break my promises. I would maybe not always care. I would maybe not always show up for my friends the way I ought to. But in case of artificial intelligence, oh, it's always going to be there. It's never going to leave you. But it doesn't make the relationship meaningful. Can we even call it a relationship in the first place? And talking about our unique histories and perspectives, we have the kinds of bodies we have in virtue of our biological, historical, and cultural location. We're not sculpted after an ideal, right? We're located in particular places at particular times. And this is as a result of our experiences. And these things are things we bring into our close personal relationships. These are things that that makes us different. My experiences will be different from the next person's experiences. But the chatbots, artificial intelligence, is just sculpted after, okay, this is what a friendly person should look like. And then there's just like some programming. It's like, okay, when a friendly person is responding to the other person, well, they would use this type of words. When someone is angry, they would use this type of words, which would not be authentic, right? Again, our capacity to withdraw and our need to love in ways that exclude is a very crucial part of our close personal relationships, right? When you it's like in a class of like, say, like in a class of like 20 people, right? You can't be friends with all 20 persons. You can't, like, if you were to fall in love with somebody in a class, you would fall in love with one person. It's that exclusion of the one person from the group of the possible options that makes that person special, that makes that relationships, precious. But you have the case where the artificial intelligence can be friends with 1,000 people, millions, billions of people, if all they need to do is just click a button, pay for a subscription, and it's gonna be there, always there. Um, so yeah, customizable comfort rather than friction of finite human persons. Yeah, so with AI, you have, the app that's always going to be there, the chatbot that's never going to be there. Rather than a complex histories and perspective, you have machine learning models that aim to share thresholds and equilibria. And the goal of these models is generally to meet expectations, right? It's not gonna tell you no. Just like, you could have like a hard conversation with your friend or your romantic partner, and like you don't know how the conversation is gonna go. Are they gonna say yes? Are they gonna say no? But with the chatbots, it's most likely going to say yes to you, and it's not going to reject you. It's going to meet your needs, meet your expectations. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to hand over to
Great, great,
Chanda.
thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think what's key here is that we're saying that the morally salient aspects of close personal relationships are going to be shaped or marked by embodied particularity and finitude and scarcity. So it's in some sense constitutive of those kinds of obligations or imperatives or morally salient features that finitude is part of that. By contrast, machine learning systems of the kind that we're studying are generally going to be something like, at least, multiply realizable abstract objects. So these abstract objects, of course, they can do a lot of things that we can't. They can be a lot of places we can't. They can tackle cognitive tasks that are way beyond our own capacities. And yet, part of our argument in this paper is that it's precisely our limitation that lends the morally salient properties to close personal relationships. So we saw in the movie, very famously in Her, and more recently in that German movie, I Am Your Man, kind of an exploration of these problems of exclusivity and finitude and withdrawal. So we're going to insist in some sense that what's morally relevant about our, for example, our capacity, or our human love, for example, is our capacity to withdraw and to exclude. We don't love everyone. We don't even love the same person the same way all the time. We prefer some people to others. And these preferences aren't neutral. They're not merely arbitrary preferences. The chatbot, of course, can simultaneously, as in the movie, in Her, if you haven't seen it, Samantha, the chatbot, I guess it was Samantha, I can't remember the name, can simultaneously talk with thousands and thousands of people, simultaneously be, quote unquote, acting like it's in love with thousands and thousands of people. So Theodore in the movie, the character that Joaquin Phoenix plays, asks Samantha whether she's simultaneously talking to anyone else during their conversations. And he's very sad when she confirms that she's talking with thousands of people and that she's fallen in love with hundreds of them. And he's upset with this idea. And of course, our first reaction, let's say a first pass, is that, oh, well, this is sort of male proprietary behavior, and that this is just his primitive his primitive male mind being jealous, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's actually a mistake. I think what Theodore is realizing is that there's actually a kind of a conceptual problem with, whoops, I don't seem to be able to, there we go. That in a sense, you or I, our embodied natures make it basically impossible to love in this kind of radically non-exclusive way. I mean, people vary with respect to exclusivity, but they certainly don't love hundreds or thousands of people. And it's not merely a matter of kind of the cognitive load or how challenging that might be. We seem to be, in a sense, stuck with exclusivity and exclusion. And we want to say that in some sense, that is what we doubt that Samantha really loves anyone in the same way that we might doubt that, let's say, a sperm donor with thousands and thousands of biological offspring is really a father. So, for example, we could imagine in competitive contexts where the interests of your child are very, you would favor your child in certain kinds of ways, and that in some sense that's morally obligatory, right? So we could try to unpack why that would be the case. But at the very least, even if we wouldn't call it directly morally obligatory, we would say that it's somehow constitutive of the relationship of a father to his children, that he favors their interests over others in competitive contexts, in non-zero contexts. The fact is that the sperm donor, let's say, imagine him standing in front of a football stadium with thousands of his biological offspring gathered together. He wouldn't be able to favor his offspring in paternal ways, given the fact that there's so many of them and given the fact that their interests will conflict with one another, quite simply. So there's sort of even just a conceptual difference that we can detect between the situation of the sperm donor with thousands of offspring versus the situation of a typical father, typical human father, with maybe at most some small finite number of offspring. Okay, so we can see, for example, that there are obligations that are imposed or maybe constitutive of parent-child relationships. And we can see also that close personal relations of different kinds come with different kinds of associated obligations. So our spousal relationships, our duties to our parents, our siblings, our friends, our children, and so on. Teacher-student relationships, they all involve different kinds of obligations that are in some sense constitutive of those relationships. And that's where we'd like to end today. And thank you for your time. I think we did okay with time. So there's lots to discuss. We could talk a lot about platform design. We could talk a lot about the distinction. Well, maybe I'll wrap it up there. But thank you so much, and we're eager for the conversation that will follow. So thanks.
Yes, so we can start the Q&A now. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I have one question. Yes, should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay, so thanks for the wonderful talk. It was really a good one. So my question is more specific. So there are problems, especially in relationships like intimate partner violence and all those specific problems. So do you think a chatbot like that can help the survivors of such problems? And or do you think that the chatbots are more like generic and don't focus on these specific problems? So how to go about it?
Okay, so I think with chatbots, it's okay, it's normal that like human like relationships would have like, you know, frictions, but of course like not to the point of like violence. And like, you know, again, like I don't think anybody should stay in any violent relationship. But with chatbots, they first of all, because they wouldn't say no to you, I don't even think that there would be any sort of friction in the first place. So it doesn't even would feel like it's gonna be like you're just talking to somebody who is always gonna say yes to you, always gonna not like oppose you, not gonna question you. And even if we were to program a chatbot in a way that it would say no a lot of times, like from some of the things we've seen, maybe it says no at the first time, and then you just need to change your words, and then it says yes, so it's like really agreeable. And so I don't know that it's gonna give the same feeling that it would give if it were like a human relationship. Yeah, maybe to avoid conflicts, it would work because like, you know, you wouldn't have arguments and all that. But I think by virtue of who we are as human beings, we're bound to have frictions, we're bound to have disagreements, we're bound to see things differently. And like, I think those things are like what makes relationships beautiful. And like, if you cannot have that with a chatbot, so yeah.
Great. I think also maybe efforts so far to create kind of psychoanalytic chatbots or let's say therapeutic chatbots, those have run into significant, I think, quasi-technical obstacles. We could talk more about that, but ultimately the use of LLMs in therapeutic contexts needs very careful consideration. There's we can talk offline about specific instances where these things have sort of encouraged patients to kill themselves or encouraged patients to harm themselves inadvertently, insofar as the chatbots themselves are, let's say, the early versions at least were kind of unaligned conformity machines, or consensus machines. So in terms of medical or quasi-medical applications, I think we need to proceed with caution. But of course, the promise here is that, yeah, indeed, this is a kind of low-cost solution for therapy for people who are in difficult situations, who don't have access to the kinds of resources that would allow them to have a trained human therapist or counselor of various kinds. So I think what motivates your question is partly, it's shaped by the landscape of problems that we're interested in here, where, questions of cost are critically important. Questions of access are really important. And the potential to, genuinely exercise social capacities in our case, or let's say in the case of your question, therapy, might be facilitated by these systems, would be facilitated by these systems. So there are certainly trade-offs involved. We're not taking a hard and fast stance that says, these things are just wrong or bad or whatever. But we want to be able to draw the distinction between, let's say, in our case, exercise of social capabilities or capacities versus the kinds of imperatives that are involved in genuine relationships with persons, and persons being anyway. So yeah, so thank you for your question. Could go on and on all day.
Thanks for the answer.
Then I think Dr. Ba has a question.
Yes, thank you. I saw a few people had questions in the chat. Did you want to ask them first, Divya, or is it okay for me to go ahead?
Either way works. I think you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, John and Shay, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. It was really interesting. I do have a few questions. I'll just ask one now and maybe come back later if there's no further questions. A lot of the concepts you used in identifying and characterizing relationships implicated trust, but I don't remember too much mention of trust per se. I was just wondering how much the concept of trust could be, used to sort of frame some of the questions that you have. I mean, one of my observations, I guess, contentions is we may come to trust some artificial agent in a social situation, but can they really trust us? And if we don't have the sense that they trust us, then we might judge that they're lacking some sort of phenomenological state. They're just using terms that satisfy us, but they don't have an actual sense of trust in us. So we lose the sense of mutuality between the two, between the human and the artificial agent. This sense of I and thou that is important to forming personal connections and, genuinely obtaining a relationship of trust.
Good. Want to take that?
No, I think you should go.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a really beautiful observation. The idea that there is no reciprocal relationship between the machine and ourselves with respect to trust, I think is critically important. Notice that this is one of our kind of hobby horses, is in the AI ethics literature or in the alignment literature, et cetera. when people think about trust and trust in AI, of course, as your question indicates, they're thinking about it in the other direction. Sort of what tech people call users, namely us, user trust in AI systems. Now, I think at this point, it's quite straightforward to create the feeling of trust in so-called users, in human beings who are exposed to these systems. We can certainly cultivate the feeling of trust in that direction. Now, there's an important distinction to be drawn between trustworthiness and systems that induce the feeling of trust. That's an important distinction that's sometimes overlooked in the AI ethics literature. What your question points to is the idea that trust should be a reciprocal mode of relating to one another. So yeah, and certainly that would be a case where, yeah, the idea that the system wouldn't be capable of trusting or not trusting us tells us something. Maybe you have more to say about that, Bill, because I think it's a really good insight.
Yeah, I might. There are quite a few other people with hands up. I want to let them get to it, but no, but your answer is definitely helpful. Yeah, yes, I was interested in the, the reciprocal nature of the relationship,
Right.
where each has a sense of the other, not just
Right.
that they're saying the right words as a large language model might, but that they have a associated, feeling or phenomenological state behind it.
Right. So
If
we
that's
could
what we just
imagine
believe,
like a machine version of trust, right? So the machine would be concerned with security, with provenance, with verifiability, with a kind of the machine might be concerned concerned in quotation marks, designed to make sure that the person that it is interacting with is actually who that person says they are. So those kinds of things, of course, we could distinguish from the kind of trust that you're talking about. So in computer science, of course, the idea would be that we want to ensure that the security of the interaction is maintained. But you're thinking of something more serious than that. Yeah, I think it's certainly something that I'd like to think more about, and appreciate the question.
Thank you so much.
I mean, I was just going to say, it also sort of bleeds into the discussion around privacy, right? Like, if you're in quote a relationship with a chatbot, you would want to reveal things about yourself to this chatbot because relationships breed intimacy. You want to say things, that you wouldn't tell other people to this chatbot. And then it means if you can trust it, then you go ahead to share these things. But if you can't trust it, it means you wouldn't go ahead to share that. And in cases where you do go ahead to share it, it's the question of who gets this information, who at the back end would have access to this personal information that I am sharing. So yeah, it's for me, it sort of bleeds a little bit into like the question of privacy and data and so,
Right.
mm.
I think Bill's question, though, raises it sort of flips it around. Like there's no question of privacy for a chatbot because in some sense there's nothing there to hide.
Yeah.
Similarly, it doesn't, trust is irrelevant for the chatbot because there's nothing at risk for the chatbot, broadly speaking. Okay, great.
Thank you, Bo.
Thanks.
Jacob, you can go ahead.
Oh, thank you guys for this. It's been very informative. My question is, I've seen it used with a lot of elderly people with Alzheimer's or memory issues, like an AI companion, something like a fake pet I've seen has grown in popularity. But my question is, using a chatbot for anybody with cognitive disabilities, do you think that would actually improve their cognitive understanding of what's going on, or potentially cause more harm and lacking in understanding of whether or not their past memory is something that happened it's real with like an actual person, or something that they're confusing with an AI?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think it depends really. In cases of somebody with Alzheimer's, who would be interacting with like a care bot, it will be there to sort of like remind the person of maybe some of the things they've said before, some of the things that has happened to them before, and can sort of serve as a reminder, like so that this person doesn't like keep forgetting. And like we could even sort of like relate it to how we currently like interact with our phones, right? So for example, you're trying to do something and you don't want to forget, you quickly, take your phone and then you maybe put on your reminder app or something. And like that sort of like enhances, maybe not directly, but it's something you can always fall back on. So, but with patients with Alzheimer's, for example, if they would be interacting with care bots who would help them remember certain things, then definitely we would say, well, yes, it sort of enhances their relationships, like that aspect, it enhances their memory. But in cases where, it's a more like another like medical condition where they're made to feel like, oh, this thing I'm interacting with is a real person. And then we come to questions around like, deception. Are they deceived into thinking that, the robot or the however like this AI like is embodied, like are they deceived into thinking, oh, it's real, it's a real person I'm interacting with? Then if they're made to be deceived that, oh, it's a real person, then we have questions of, okay, are we messing up with their reality? What would they think of as truth? Like, what is a lie? And so for me, it's a very tricky question
Yeah.
to answer. So I think I'm just gonna leave it at that.
Yeah, I love the question too, because it sort of highlights the difference between, let's say, the potentially beneficial health benefits or salutary effects of these kinds of systems, and the moral component. So as Shay is saying, for example, those of us who have friends or family members with Alzheimer's, the first 3 or 4 times that the person repeats the story or asks the question, it's fine, and we can play along. But at a certain point, our tolerance or our patience or our attention begins to fade. And so we might become impatient with the autistic person, or the person with Alzheimer's, and we might get frustrated, etc. Whereas the system wouldn't. It wouldn't. So that kind of negative encounter would be forestalled. So I think clearly, if someone has the capacity to practice, let's say the core cognitive capabilities around conversation, around interacting with others, that's a good thing. As Shay is saying, though, the question becomes, like, to what extent are we engaged in morally blameworthy action when we deceive someone who has Alzheimer's and who's severely sort of suffering from Alzheimer's? And those are very, very difficult questions and really tough trade-offs. Those are the kinds of things we're going to be faced with as we start deploying these systems in those kinds of care contexts. Yeah, so lots of open questions. Just for us, for the purpose of this talk, we just want to draw that distinction between the morally relevant properties of those interactions versus the kind of public health story we tell about improved capabilities or the exercise of social capacities. So we want to draw that distinction here. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Parker, you can go.
Hi, yes. Firstly, thank you both for the presentation. It was very, very nice. I noticed that, through the data you presented, loneliness is clearly on the rise in the United States. And so these chatbots are kind of serving as a substitute for some sort of companionship and some sort of relationship And so to kind of remedy some of that loneliness. And so I guess my question is that could this increased exposure to these chatbots kind of skew perception of real life relationships and kind of put more of a strain on some personal connections that we already have, and therefore maybe have a net negative effect if it's just kind of like this spiral of, continuously relying on a chatbot for possible companionship. So I want to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely it would affect our the reliance on, technology for our daily or everyday interaction would definitely affect how we relate to other people. So for example, like interacting with other people is not just because like we're social beings, right? It also helps us like build social skills. So for example, well, if when I'm in public, I can like just make noise, there's, when I'm driving, I have to like obey traffic rules just so that there's other in society. Like these are skills that you learn because you're in a community with other people. But if all of the interaction is just based on technology, then it means that if you do get to be in community or with other people, then it sort of feels like maybe you wouldn't know what to do, or it affects how you even like, relate to other people, right? Because one, these chatbots, like I said earlier, are not going to tell you no. It means you probably would not know how to handle rejection, right? Like when you face with other humans, who would tell you no, or like who would not even agree with you, right? So it's like there are a lot of skills and a lot of benefits that we get from, maybe some of them are like very obvious and some of them not very obvious, that we get from interacting with other human beings, that if there's so much dependence on, chatbots or robots or these apps, that we'll be losing out so much on what we get from human to human interaction. And yes, like loneliness is a thing, and people are trying to deal with it, the way they know how. But if we shift like away from human to human connections, then we will be faced with a lot of problems. So I mean, for us, we think no, like people shouldn't, replace human beings with artificial intelligence, because there's just so many like, crucial things that come out as a result of our interactions with like other people, that, if there's just that dependence on AI, you wouldn't be able to, carry them out like with other human beings. So yes, I think definitely, to answer your question simply, I think yes, it's gonna have like negative effect on, interactions with other human beings. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I think we're out of time, and I think we have a few more questions. So you can reach out to me about the questions, and I can ask the presenters. So, and thank you for really wonderful and interesting presentation today.
Thanks. And we're
Thank
we're
you.
both easily accessible, social media, email, etc. So go ahead and reach out to either of us for your questions and follow-ups also. But thank you so much for the opportunity
Yeah.
to present this work.
Thank you both.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.